Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. So, today I'm really excited to introduce Florence. Florence is a user experience and a service designer, but she's also a researcher. But she's also a digital strategist. And she does some really exciting things combining ethnographic methodologies with lean UX techniques. And don't worry if you don't understand all these words yet. I bet we will by the end of this session. But she uses these techniques to get a deep understanding of people's contextual needs. What are people coming to the website to get and to do and to learn? And she's developed digital products and services for clients across a range of sectors, doing stuff from cybersecurity, which sounds terribly impressive, and doing things in the museum and heritage section. Let's all welcome Florence, please. Hi, Florence.
Hello, hi.
Thank thank you so much for joining us.
No, it's really great to be here. And yeah, I hope this will be a useful introductory session to user-centered design.
Yeah.
And I suspect the way it will probably work best is if people can keep putting your questions and any comments you might have in the chat throughout this, and then maybe at the end, then we'll come back to
Yeah.
all the
Let's do the
questions.
questions at the end. That sounds really reasonable. I'm going to gracefully bow out, give you your.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, introductory user-centered design methods and approaches. So first of all, obviously, hello. My name is Florence, as has been said, and yes, I work as a user experience and service designer. And I thought I'd just come along and give like a very high-level kind of introduction to what user-centered, or indeed, as I prefer to call it, human-centered design is all about. So yes, I figured it might be best to start off just by talking a bit about like the overall ethos of human-centered design, and then we'll go a bit into like tools and skill sets and things that can help you actually make sure that you're making stuff that people truly need and will use. So as it says here, obviously, what human-centered design is really all about is just making sure that you're actually solving people's real needs. And you're doing so constantly throughout your development process, and making sure that you are testing and validating with actual people. So the kind of the overview of how one might approach doing human-centered design is a bit as follows. So you might start off with like the inspiration step, where you kind of got like maybe a hunch or like a general idea for something that you might want to make. Then there's the ideation, where you're really focusing on what it is, on all the different ideas about how this thing might work in reality. And then the implementation. So when it kind of goes out to the community of users, and yeah, they start using it. And kind of using the language from design thinking, you might also see these stages broken down further. So into sort of like, so with the inspiration stage, that might be broken down into the empathize step and the definition step. So that's where you're really trying to do as much upfront research. So you might be doing lots of surveys, you might be doing lots of interviews, you might be looking at a lot of data, Google Analytics data or other user analytics platforms. And then you kind of really have to narrow in on what the actual, like really the tangible problem is. What is the thing that people actually use whatever it is that you've made for? And then, you go into ideation, when you're kind of really trying to think about everything from technical feasibility to different ways of interacting with the product to the interface to potential data sources and APIs. So that's kind of got, that can have absolutely everything there. And then there's also the prototype step. And this does kind of cross over between the ideation and implementation, because after you've kind of come up with all your great ideas, you want to make something that you can actually test and see if it's working. And actually, sometimes that prototype might be enough to be what some people will call a minimum viable product, or an MVP for short. And that means you've kind of already gone into implementation stage. But in other cases, maybe the thing that you've made, the prototype you've made, really does need to kind of go back to these early stages And so then you're kind of going back to either doing more research, so doing more empathizing and defining, or maybe you need to do a bit more ideation, so thinking about other ways of solving the problem. And then once that's kind of, and throughout this process, you'll always be testing. So even when something is out amongst the people, as it were, that doesn't mean it's finished. Basically, you will always be getting feedback from users about how it is that they're using it, and whether it's made any substantial difference for them. So yeah, there's a lot of back and forth between the test and prototype stages and the testing and the ideation, because obviously you might find out something new and then you might have to go back and rethink a few things. So just to wrap up, empathizing is where you'll be doing the research to really understanding the people that you're designing for. So really getting to their actual problems and their actual needs. The definition bit is where you'll start like being very clear about what the requirements from the user's perspective, and indeed, yourselves as makers would be, and making sure that you're very clear on the different contexts as well, which will impact the exact needs that the users might have. The ideation, which is where you're coming up with as many different solutions as possible. That just means you're more likely to hit upon something that will actually work, and you can often use the best bits of different ideas. The prototyping step, so that's when you're really making the things based on your ideas. And the key thing I always say between like a prototype and like a pretty design or a general idea is that a prototype is testable. In fact, in some ways, you want to kind of prove yourself wrong. That's almost like the best mindset to go into when you're making a prototype or making something to test. You actually want to see if your initial idea is completely wrong. And that's how, and with that mindset, that means that means that you'll be setting up the experiment and getting the right kind of data to actually show why it is that what you've made is actually good. And then obviously, as I mentioned, the testing bit, which is where you have to go out amongst your users and see how it actually works in the real world, as it were. And yeah, once again, don't worry, as you kind of do these processes, they're not strictly linear. There's a lot of back and forth between each of these little steps. Just a reminder. So, so as I mentioned before, you've got all these different, I suppose, steps in how one will create something that is optimized, that is really, really great for users, for actual people. And as you do these, I thought it would be quite helpful just to also illustrate like the range of skill sets that are required for this work. So if perhaps you're new to development or to design or whatever, don't worry. I mean, I myself, I'm not a trained designer per se. I came in through a research route. But like, yeah, so if you're not from like a tech background, actually there's lots of skills that you'll have from like your previous experience that's really key actually to being a good either a good UX designer or at the very least making things that your users actually will use. So I figured we'd start off thinking about that that research phase. Like, to begin with, what you'll want to do is just make sure you're talking to people. And you can do things like you can create proper surveys. My advice is always to keep those fairly snappy. There's no strict number, but like, it's really great if you can almost limit yourself to like 10, maybe 15 questions if there's something that, if really needs be. But, if you can get it down to like 10 questions, that's really great. And making sure that whenever you put questions in your survey, that they're a mix of like closed questions. So a closed question is something like that can give you an answer that's like yes, no, or like a particular option. Whereas open questions, which tend to give you qualitative data and need a bit more analysis, tends to be more things like give us an example of, or how would you feel if, so those kind of more either more speculative, more emotional kind of questions, also kind of questions where you're really trying to tease out the unteasable, so the things that people can't easily just say yes or no to. So that's the kind of data that's also really good to have. And so there's a range of tools that you can use for actually storing the data using, Excel, Google Sheets, or Calc. Anything that makes it easy to analyze is often quite useful. You can use a range of different tools for making forms. At work, we tend to use a lot of Microsoft Forms, or because a lot of our work is done with websites and existing platforms, we can use other tools like Hotjar, which I'll bring up a bit later as well. If you really, really want to get into it, and if you're someone who's had experience with statistical programming, this is a point where you can use those skills. So using R or Python to analyze the data and to create sort of data visualizations, which can really help the rest of your team understand what really sticks out from what people are saying about what their needs and their context, right? And if you've got something so it's maybe you haven't quite got the full platform that's been made, but maybe you have some initial designs, perhaps from someone else, or maybe you think that actually the best way to get people's opinions about something is to actually kind of show them an impression or an idea of what you have. Tools like Usability Hub are really great, because what you can do is you can actually input an image and add questions, and then you can share the link around. So you're kind of doing a mix of you are basically doing a survey, but it's not just based on did you do this? Do you like this? It's actually based on their impressions of a very, very early prototype. So so when it comes to the research aspect, some skill sets and toolkits that might be useful here. Doing lots of surveys and talking to people, and using spreadsheets and and other surveying platforms to help you out. I think one of the other things that's really great as well about spreadsheets, even though it might sound a bit scary, they're not, because actually one of the things that they do is they help you really structure your questions. So if you can imagine that, as you're entering the data in the spreadsheet, if you can almost imagine yourself trying to basically make sense of whatever it is that you're putting in. If at any point you realize, oh no, I don't even know what kind of formula I would need to analyze this data, that's actually a really great hint to you. Maybe you need to break down the question a bit more, or maybe you need to keep that answer to be fully qualitative. And so then you would do what we call mapping, which I'll get onto, or I'll get onto an example of that. So that's why spreadsheets can be super, super helpful, even if they don't sound particularly techy or whizzy or exciting. They can actually help you a lot with your process. One of the other, so once you've kind of got all this data, what else might really help? So we often use what we call empathy maps. So this is a way of displaying all the knowledge that you know about your users. I mentioned before, when you're doing surveys and when you're talking to people, you will want some qualitative data. And this is one way that we use to analyze that qualitative data. So an empathy map will look a bit like this. And what you do is you kind of go through all the things that people have said to you, and you sort of cluster together the notes that are related to these following, I suppose, values in a sense. So the value of thinking and feeling, you will kind of go through the interview, and using post-it notes, you can add okay, they think that, I don't know, if the thing that you want to make is a really great ticketing product, so people can get tickets for any amazing experience, like concert or whatever around them. if someone has in the interview or in the survey, they say something like, oh, I think it's like, it seems kind of difficult because there's just everything seems a bit up in the air with COVID or whatever. And then you can put here, okay, they might feel a bit overwhelmed because there's so many different bits of information to put together. If they maybe have said something that relates to maybe rumors or things that people around them say, then you can add those notes to this section. Say what do they hear value, and so on and so forth. So this is it's just a really simple, a comparatively simple way of doing that qualitative analysis, right? You've got really interesting data, and this is a really good way of trying to understand it in a way which is actionable. So which is in a way that means that you can actually do something with it. It's not just nice to know, it will tangibly change something. Some of the other tools I've mentioned here, so Hotjar and there's very similar tools. So that's another thing. I think for anything I put in this tools list, never feel it's the ultimate tool. In fact, the next best thing to do after this talk would be to go through each of these suggested tools and search for alternatives, because then you'll see that there's a whole range of different tools that can do very similar things as well. So these are just things that I personally use or I use quite often and I've had a lot of experience with. But Hotjar is also quite useful because not only can you do surveys and things with it, if you've got like a website or a web app or some kind of digital platform with a URL, you can also do like recordings as well. So you can kind of watch people use the site over a couple of pages. And that's a really nice way, again, of kind of just seeing how someone's actually using it and seeing maybe the things that you didn't realize would be an issue, but is actually like a stumbling block for the person who's using it. So that's all the good stuff for the when you're doing that upfront research. I mentioned then often after you've done all that research, you'll really need some time to not just kind of analyze the data, but then think about, okay, how am I actually going to use this? Like I figured out what it means, but what do I actually do with this? And this is what I think I do think we have this temptation, not for everyone, obviously, but I do think for a lot of us in tech, it's really tempting to think that anything good you're going to come up with immediately. And actually, it can often be the opposite. But actually, what you really do need, and as makers, as the creators of essentially a new kind of future, really, you need to give yourself the time to really think through what it is that can actually solve the problem that you've identified. So if I go back to, say, this empathy map, you might have found that there's like a lot of pains, a lot of frustrations with like the current products or the current issue that a user group is experiencing. And then it can be really tempting to think, oh, okay, got it. Okay, this is the one thing that will absolutely solve it. But actually what you need to do is you need to give yourself the time to sketch out as many different possible solutions. And in a way, what you're doing is you're almost being like a scientist. Basically, you're trying to come up with as many different, they might call them hypotheses, and we might call them challenges or questions. And you want to see all the different ways that you can solve this problem. Not only will it mean that you end up having something that's a bit more resilient because of the fact that like it's absolutely the best. You've done all the testing and you can absolutely say, okay, out of like 8, 10, 12 options, this is the one that absolutely works or works the best. It also means you can bring in lots of different best features of different ideas together in ways that you might not initially have envisioned. And I think it's also really important as well, just for yourselves as makers, really, to really be able to understand like the different choices that you have to make and the things that have to be played off against each other. And that helps you later on as well, because it helps you deal with things like feature creep, for example, where you end up just adding more and more like, oh, wouldn't this be nice to have type features? And then you sort of end up destroying a really great experience. And then even though you might have a Swiss Army knife of a product or a thing that can do lots of different things, nobody will use it because it's too difficult to learn, for example. So that's a nice thing about really taking this time out and coming up with as many different solutions. And I would also say, especially for yourselves as like developers, when you're at this stage, don't just think about the technical solutions, also think about like maybe all that's needed is a PO box. Maybe all that's needed is an easy, like a new email. Maybe all that's needed is actually just really like actually non-digital, non-technical solutions. And that's a really good skill for when you then go into work as developers, as technologists, because it means then that you're more able to work and liaise with other departments and other people with other expertise. And that's really, really important for building up that camaraderie, for really building up those relationships. And it's also really good because you might then identify much more interesting problems that need to be solved. And finally, it's just really helpful for you to understand those like deeper layers of the technology stack. So it helps you really think about, okay, but in the time that I'm given, I can actually only achieve, like I can't achieve an amazing, like immersive experience. What actually is it that I can do with the tools and with the technologies that I have in the time that I have and the skills that I have? So that's why I've gone a lot into this, but I think it's one of those stages that often gets like underestimated, like the importance of really thinking through all the different potential solutions to a problem. And then once you've done that, you can go, once you've kind of got the initial design, then we go into the prototyping and testing stages. One of the great bits of feedback I got from a very senior service designer was that like the difference between a prototype and something that's just kind of nice is that a prototype will actually tell you when you've done something wrong. So long as it's telling you if something has gone wrong, like so long as it's telling you if a user doesn't really understand something or if they don't really use it, that's the thing that makes it a prototype. It doesn't have to be like a fully interactive prototype. It can be a sketch, it can be a workflow, it can even be a whole web app. But the important thing for a prototype is that it tells you if you've got something wrong. And so some of the tools that might be quite useful, yes, there are like the big well-known prototyping tools, so like UXPin, Adobe XD, and Figma. HTML and CSS, I actually really, I always say if you can, it's really great to kind of keep yourself to using HTML and CSS for prototyping. It makes sure that your HTML is on point, which again is often like underestimated. And it means that you begin to see just how much you can do without having to use fancy frameworks and lots of JavaScript, which can often make your product less accessible in the long term. And also it's easier for you as well often when you actually go to build the full thing because you've kind of already got the skeleton ready for you. And other tools as well. I mean, I've already mentioned Hotjar and Usability Hub, but this is definitely the point where if you haven't already, really start testing things out for accessibility. So in terms of the design, it might be the color contrasts you need to test very rigorously. Testing if images work on top of, if text works on top of images, and indeed vice versa. Testing different combinations, testing font sizes, testing whether it would actually be able to be used by someone not using a mouse, for example, or just using like their keyboard. Like really this is the point to really start drilling in and making sure that as much as possible, what you've got is something that can be used and can be experienced in a range of different conditions and by people with a range of accessibility needs. And then finally, because this is like the big one, but again, it's one of those that doesn't often get talked about as much, especially to developers, which I think is a shame actually, because I think certainly when you get into working as full-time developers, and even now, but certainly at that point, again, it's a really great way of showing that you appreciate that, like, what you're making is more than the sum of its parts. And it shows that you're really aware of the context that you're in. It shows you're aware of the company that you're in, the amazing people that you'll be working with, and really appreciating their skill sets and how important they are to actually making the technology actually, be useful or usable. So this particular tool, this is the customer journey map. And the point of this kind of like sums up absolutely everything that you might have done. So sometimes you can get away with using, a UX designer can sometimes get away with just this, like not even having to bother too much with an empathy map or persona. I mean, but that's in particular situations. But that just shows how powerful this particular approach is. And basically what you're doing is you're thinking about the user journey as they use your product, obviously to solve a problem that they have, but you're not just thinking about it from one perspective, like from your perspective, maybe as a developer, you're also thinking about it from the perspective of every single person who helps to make that experience an actual experience, who helps the user to actually solve the problem. So let me illustrate that. So as I said, you'll start off mapping out how someone actually, what they do. So they might start off with, oh, I really want to be able to find out what events are available to me, especially given how uncertain things are right now. So that might be how it starts off. And then throughout the journey, you will map out, okay, they come to this web app, or maybe they go to a social media account, they maybe input a date or a time, and they get some type of information, and then they kind of go off, use that information to go to an event, or indeed to use that information to maybe reschedule the event if it gets cancelled, be able to get refunds and all of that jazz. So that's the first bit that you want to do. Actually write out a user's journey. And then once you've done that, what you'll start doing, you'll also, often this is something that the designer will do, so don't worry too much about that. So the designer will include, say, like the workflow, but from the perspective of the actual interface. So whether it's the website or the app or kind of whatever product it is. And so they will, for every particular step that a user takes, they will say, okay, that means they'll be on this screen, they'll have to click on this, or they'll have to do this on the screen, and then it takes them to this next step. The thing that, as I said, I think what's so powerful about this and why it's a shame it's not often like explicitly taught in like UX for developers is that you don't just stop there, you keep going. So you say, okay, they're on this screen and they're on that screen in order to achieve a particular task here. What are the calls that need to be made in the middle layer of the stack? What happens under particular connectivity, like what might cause the API not to work? Actually, what is the state of the data within the APIs? Are there any gaps? And that obviously can influence the interface design. But then that might also influence, say, at this point, if you're having to think about the support team. Now, you might be in a place that doesn't have like a customer service team, but really the point of this really is to show what's needed to make all of this really lovely stuff work. So if, for example, as a developer, okay, under very low connectivity, this really key bit of information might not be able to be surfaced. That is a way for you to say, okay, then we need backup. We will need someone acting as support or we will need to provide some kind of information, support information, to enable the customer to be able to have that experience. So really, that's all that a customer experience map is. It's making sure that you're having visibility of all the different things that enable someone to be able to accomplish a particular task. Um, and and that isn't just in the positive sense, like they go to a website, they find the information, hurrah, life is good. It's also thinking about, well, what if they don't find the information, or what if they're looking for very specific like accessibility information, or what happens if like if say they're from like a place where there's lots of power cuts, and it's like, okay, well, what happens then? Like, what happens under all these conditions, and what happens at all these different layers of the customer journey? What happens then? So that's basically why it's really cool, and it's a great way of finding out like new things that might need to be added, as I said, as well as like helping you understand how everyone has to work together. Sorry, so this is an example. This is, well, not really an example, it's more of a template. And you can and this is often the kind of thing that I will end up making, and will often make sure that these are made as a group, and people who have different expertise will be the ones to like complete in all the different information. And as I said, it's just a nice way of making sure that you kind of got a sense of all the different things going on that are needed to make your product work. So as I said, the top row is all about what they actually do. Then the next row is about how they how they interact with the interface at each step of the journey. And then underneath that, you want to show things like what are the API calls that are happening, what are the backend transactions that are happening, and what's the other bits of information, who else is needed. If something goes wrong, do they have to call a number? Do they have to send by email? And if they do have to send an email to someone, how soon are they likely to hear back, to be able to resolve their issue? And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that kind of go into that. But actually, it can be weirdly like summarized, even though it might seem quite complicated. And often it's summarized by starting off with a user story. So a user story will be something like, as a particular user, I want to achieve this so that I want to have, let's say, a website or web app that can help me achieve a bigger problem. And that's a really great way for doing, for completing this very first bit, right? And understanding exactly what it is that they'll be interacting with, and understanding what their end goal actually is. So for example, if someone ultimately wants to have a great time and just wants to have a really easy experience finding out about events near them, but that might tell you as a developer, okay, I need to always be giving great feedback, maybe having some micro interactions, because ultimately they just really want to have a great time and feel good about going out. So what can I do as a developer to help my user feel that way? So yeah. So I hope that's kind of given a kind of helpful overview about what human-centered design is. I've put in some links for things that I find really helpful in terms of like, almost, I think maybe for you as developers, they're more useful just to kind of get a sense of what data one tries to get out and how you can use that data to make a good experience. And definitely check out things like tarot cards of tech, which are also really helpful for thinking about how something might scale, and how particular user types or user archetypes will help you think about like, okay, from a technical perspective, what needs to be included in the product, or in the service that you're making. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And then I'll just go through the questions, I guess, if that's okay.
Yeah. If it's useful, would it be helpful to talk through them with a voice just to make sure that folks who can't see them on screen can still get them? So I'll go ahead and ask them
Yes.
to you if that's not a weird one.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Hello again. And thank you so much. These were things I really, really wanted you to be able to share with folks, and it was so, so valuable. So we had a really good question right at the start. Oh, where's my um, and Tanya was asking, hey, you talked about needing to use both closed and open questions. What's a good ratio on that? Or does it differ project to project?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. Yes, it does differ from project to project, I'm afraid. I think I usually though, because a lot of the stuff I tend to do, I tend to find like if you're working from almost like a midpoint, you might end up having lots of closed questions and one or two open questions. So my theory, and maybe you can test this out for me, my theory is it's almost like if you're at the beginning of a project, you want more open. And it's almost like the closer you get to the end of a project, you want to fit that ratio so that you get more closed questions than open.
So when you're beginning a project, you've got these big daydreamy, oh, what do you think about this? What kinds of ways would you use this? And when you're about three-quarters of the way done, you want to be like, wait, is this better blue or gray? What do you need?
Basically. Yeah.
And Tanya's just asking all of these great questions and saying, hey, you talked about prototyping tools when you were talking about prototyping and MVPs. What might be some easy ones to pick up, or what might be some important ones to try?
I will always say start off with pen and paper. And I'm not being facetious. I'm not trying to be clever or witty. And this is something I often have to tell myself off about if I get straight into the technical stuff. Using pen and paper is fantastic. Paper helps you really think about almost like how data gets layered on top of each other. Because in some cases, you might find yourself literally cutting out like tooltips or cutting out things that appear on top of a screen. Using pen and not pencil is good because it keeps you
Is it?
deliberate.
Is
It is,
it?
it is, it is. It's a thing you have to get used to, but it is actually quite good because
Mm,
it keeps you deliberate. And also, because often the temptation when you start off drawing is like, oh, I want to put everything in it, right? And it's like, actually, some with pen, you get used to this point of what I've drawn is just what's there. So don't either maybe the information I think should be provided here needs to be provided at the next screen. Or at the very least, it gets you into that mindset of keeping things simple. And you learn patterns quickly. Patterns are ways of laying out data and information that are kind of in common with lots of different products and services. So that's why pen and paper is good to start off with. And then in terms of like the technical ones, I mean, I found UX Pen quite good, but that's more because of the documentation and the community.
is that PEN or PIN?
PIN, so UX PIN, I found quite good because there's a good community. I think that's actually a really good tip actually for any tool that you're using. Check out what the support boards, check out the community, because that's often where you'll have to go if you can't figure something out.
Yeah. Uh, Other folks have questions as well, but Tanya's just coming in for these really, really good ones. And to add some context for this last one, we just finished up visual design this week. And you know what? They just had the worst teacher in the world for visual design, which was me. And they're saying, help, help. How do we get to understand what looks good on? Because you were saying, oh, well, part of it's going to be about what looks good. How do you get to the point where you develop that skill? How do you know what's Florence, what does it mean to develop good taste?
Oh gosh, you're taking me back to my Project Runway fan days. And yeah, so I mean, on that note, one way of getting an eye is almost giving yourself like an arts 101
Ooh.
course. And
I'm
by that,
seeing a lot of art stuff in here where you're like, go buy a fancy pen. Oh, you should study some art.
and very much what I mean is it doesn't have to be too deep. It can be something as simple as watch more art documentaries, watch film
Huh.
documentaries. If someone or listen to the radio, if there's an art critic talking about the latest exhibition, you don't have to do it all the time, just one off, because on it, almost immediately you will get a sense of things like color balance, ratio, um, all those the different color languages, the way different cultures think about text, the way people interact with text versus with images for communication. So that's one way I find, and it's fairly low key. If you've got a good internet connection, you can pretty much listen to or watch any of these programs that are on YouTube or Netflix or whatever. The other thing that is worth doing is if you do a browser search for UI patterns
UI
or
patterns.
anything like that. And what you'll get is probably maybe too many, but you'll start getting lots of websites that basically collect interfaces from like apps and websites. And you can start seeing, oh, isn't it interesting? Every time there's a calendar, calendars tend to be done in this particular way, maybe more in one way for Android devices versus iOS. But that's often how you start getting a sense of the way that really great UI designers have learned how to balance bits of content, how to balance interaction versus color. So yeah, I would definitely do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got a judgment call, and Paulus is asking, what's the best route into UX and UI? But I might pull back on that just because, like, oh, the best for one per. So what are some routes you often see people take into the UX UI space, or what routes do you see people take that are often really successful for them? I'm so sorry to butcher your question, my lovely.
Oh, no, it's a good question. So some people will start off doing online courses. So there is a website called Interaction Design. And also just to reassure people, I will be sending all these links and things I'm talking about over to Jess just to make absolutely sure. Don't worry.
We'll put
And
them
then,
up on the forum.
yeah.
Everything will be fine.
And I'll share the slide deck with the notes as well. So you'll have that as well to read through. So some people take courses from places like Interaction Design or Coursera, for example. I think at Stanford, quite a lot of universities have their human-centered design courses online, which you can take for free. The other way, some people get into it because they're already kind of working in a particular company in tech. So they might be working as like a front-end developer, for example, and it just so happens that they're the ones who do a lot of like the user testing, doing a lot of the usability testing, talking to people. So that can be another way in. Other people will do things like boot camps as well. So I think it really does all depend. Which way tends to work best? I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So this is very much just my opinion.
No,
So
it's as soon as you say it, it's fact. The fun thing about working with learners is once they're going to meet somebody else with a different opinion, be like, no, I talked to the preeminent expert, and she said, no pressure.
okay, so I tend to find that this it's a really interesting split. I tend to find a lot of people either come from the very academic backgrounds, they've taken lots of courses, maybe a human computer interaction course, maybe,
Sounds
and
very
that
fancy.
very, very fancy and quite expensive. And then they kind of go out into the real world. Maybe they've done like a graduate training scheme and that's how they've done it. But like, yeah, pretty much from university or whatever out into the real world. And then the other cohort I see tends to be people who've done a boot camp, and through that were given maybe some early projects or things that they could kind of add to their portfolio, and then they can start applying for jobs.
So the
And
two
either
options
way,
seem to be pay a ton of money or learn as you go.
basically, and I personally think the learn as you go, in terms of effectiveness, I would say the learn as you go is fine, because yes, you can go the pay a ton of money route, but if at the end of the day, all that people are looking at, mostly of what people are looking at is your portfolio, then learn
It's
as you go is fine.
2021. Who has a ton of money these days? And Olga's, who just always asks these amazing questions like, hey, if we're interested in getting into this space, what kind of focus might be a better fit for us? So it's like, oh, how do I know if I want to work with UI or with user experience or even user experience research?
It all depends on what problems do you feel the most satisfied when you solve. That's a metric that I not only do I use for myself, but I often use when I'm mentoring other people and talking to colleagues who I might not be mentoring, but just giving friendly advice to. And that genuinely is the thing that seems to work. So it's not even just so much what you find most interesting, because someone like me, I find everything interesting. So I can't use that as a metric at all.
Yeah.
Instead, I tend to think about, okay, when I've solved a particular problem, which ones give me the most like, yeah, oh, I've done it. So if for you, it's the spending a lot of time thinking about like how maybe different gradients, like a red to a blue gradient, and you might actually be really enjoying getting into investigating the impact that this gradient has on different users. If at the end of the day you get so much joy from solving that problem, especially maybe compared to like a problem of like analyzing some data, then actually I might say, why not explore a bit and go into and focus on UX just for a bit? Because
Yeah.
the beautiful thing, as has been said, is it's 2021. You can kind of also switch as well. I know
Yeah.
plenty of people who are really into UI, and then actually for some were like, I really want to become more of a service designer, actually. Like I love UI, but I'm really fascinated by the service design problems.
That seems like good advice. Try
Yeah.
both. We've
Yeah.
got another opinion question. I think this one's going to be a little bit spicy. Are you ready?
Oh,
Should I learn to program before I get into UI or UX work?
that is good. That is a bit spicy. And this
Because
is
there's
the
some
one.
controversy around this.
There is. I was going to say. So this is the one I'm going to get into a lot of problems about. So please
Oh,
don't report me.
to
I'm
the
very good at.
official boss of
Yes,
user experience.
yes. UX Twitter might come for me, as they say. I So straight up, I'm going to admit my bias, because I came into UX more from the technical perspective. So I was training as a graduate software developer, and kind of was, as it happened, was working a lot more on the business analysis side and like getting the user requirement side, and then ended up kind of becoming more full-time into UX and service design. I would say though that it is absolutely worth learning how to code, even if what you've learned is like the like vanilla JavaScript, but HTML, CSS, and vanilla JavaScript.
So
I would
can we say
Yes,
what vanilla? Because when I
yes.
was a little bitty baby learning to code, I was like, oh, I can't find this vanilla framework. I'm looking all over for, I mean, Angular's here, but like,
Mm.
what's vanilla JavaScript?
Yeah, what is vanilla JavaScript? So when I'm saying vanilla, and I realize I probably shouldn't have said that, because I bet you there
No, no.
is an actual framework that's called
I mean,
vanilla.
there will be
But
by the end of the week.
yeah, when I say vanilla framework, I am talking about JavaScript with no frameworks. So I'm not even talking jQuery. I'm saying it's really good to learn, if you're going to do any coding, or learn about that coding from a UX perspective. Weirdly enough, it's almost better to understand the building blocks and the foundations of the technology that you're working with, that you're designing. Um, I might even, sometimes I go even further and I say it's also really important to understand. So when I was a babby, this kind of thing was called solution architecture. So understanding the patterns of code design and the way
Oh.
APIs and things interact with, say, databases, and the way that so it's almost, sometimes it gets called full stack design. It's not really. But the difference from being a coder is that you're not learning this so that you can actually make the whole thing. And in fact, that's not really what you're learning. You're learning, as I said, patterns. So the way that particular types of functions or the way different requests get handled. You wouldn't be able to maybe program it yourself, although you could, and that might be really great if you can. But you know the difference between, with post and get, you understand that there are steps that have to happen for your lovely experience to work, and that's why it's important, because often you can come into designing an interface and it might be really beautiful, but actually at the end of the day, if you don't have all the data to give you that interface, then you don't have an interface.
So if you're designing something beautiful, but it's not technically possible to make that happen, you've just spent a lot of time with your fancy pen muttering darkly.
Yes. And then the other, so that's more from a working in the real world and making stuff perspective. I will also say it's just really useful. It's so useful. So even if you never have to think about solution architecture, you never have to think about anything else. You're working in completely optimized conditions. You're working for users who have like expendable income in the millions and have not a care in the world. Like, even in that case, it is just so much easier when you can just make the prototype yourself, or you can actually just make the thing and test rather than waiting for someone else to have time to do it for you.
So you've been very gentle, but the answer here is yes.
Yeah, yeah. But just keep it between us.
So yes, but don't tell the other cool kids.
Yeah.
So Olga said, hey, you mentioned that our HTML has to be on point. Does that mean that we've got to use semantic HTML correctly? And sort of a follow-up question saying, I think that's what that means, but what does on-point HTML look like?
Thank you for asking me that. I do have a tendency to throw in a lot of slang. Basically, yeah, semantic HTML, really. So the best way I can put this is as an example. So one of the things that, like, when I was working on a particular website a while back, we were investigating how it's understood by screen readers. And thankfully,
and that's really exciting because we're going to be joined by a head of accessibility who's a screen reader user next week on Wednesday.
Yes, do make lots and lots of notes. And there was a whole bunch of stuff coming out from the screen reader that if I didn't understand, obviously a bit about screen readers, but also if I didn't understand semantic HTML, if I didn't understand why it's important to make sure things are labeled properly, that there's ARIA labeling, that there's all the meta, I don't really, because meta actually has its own meanings in HTML, but all that really, it sounds really basic and unflashy, but it's so important for making good experiences.
I confess that a lot of times when so we're going to be starting from and the next question we've got feeds right into this. We're going to be studying accessibility from next week. And I confess that with things like alt text, I've mostly been relying on threatening my dear learners. Like, you must put this in for people using assistive tech, and I'll come to your house. And we've got somebody say, hey, how do we identify what accessibility needs we need to develop for? How do we identify who's using our website and what accessibility needs? And I've got a really good idea of what you're going to say.
Okay.
I think I think so.
I mean, so there's a bunch of ways, and in no particular order. One of the ways is simply using statistics. So these will always be underrepresented, to be clear, but look at national statistics. Look at, just look at your census data or whatever data if you're working for a particular market or a bunch of markets. Look up those countries and find out how many people, what proportion of the population have particular disabilities or accessibility needs, right? That will always give you an underestimated number because often people don't fully report the extent of their needs for very good reasons. So right then and there, you will have a baseline. You can say, great, so at least 30% of my users are going to be disabled to the extent that they would be happy and would acknowledge it as a disability. And then you can drill into that further. You can say, okay, great, at least X percentage of people will be completely blind. Perhaps another X percentage of people are likely to have limited sight. So that's often a really, really great way of just holding yourself accountable. You have to be honest and say, well, if I'm making this thing, 1 out of 5 people will have one of these particular needs. The other way, obviously, is through research. So you might want to kind of just do a shout out to people who are using your product or might be interested in using something similar. And you can say, okay, if I was making this, is there anyone with any particular disabilities that they're happy, obviously, to share? And that's a really good way then of starting to get a sense of like how many people, or like, because you can start playing around with the data. You can say, okay, if 10 people have responded, I know I'm getting 100 people. So, you can start getting a sense of perhaps, and again, that's always underestimated. I think that's super important for any demographic data, especially anyone with part of a demographic that often gets badly treated, basically. Always you're underestimating. So those are the basic ways of doing that. But I think it's also important to be clear that, like, if your product's really good, you might also hopefully have a bias. Maybe more people with disabilities will be using your site than on average, for example. That'd be really good. But also, like, because disability changes so much, and the people who might not consider themselves disabled are one group, and also the people who may well be abled now in 2 years' time and are still our users in 2 years' time might become disabled, and so therefore, like, well, these things change. So yeah, if you really want those strict numbers, look up, census data, use that. But I also think in some way, just assume every single one of your users is disabled. That's often the best way, because I like just now in this call, for example, like, I'm very, very disabled. I have appalling eyesight, and I'm sure there's many of us who could probably put our hands and say, yeah, even if it's something like, when the weather is really grey, I get super depressed and my brain functions only at 50% of
Oh,
what it
it's a
normally
good
does.
thing you hypothetically live someplace so sunny and so delightful. So I'm gonna boil that down to say, oh, you can look at census data, you can survey your users, but at the end of the day, go ahead and make it accessible across every access that you have. Yeah. We've got some questions about sort of how do I get started as UX? And I think you really covered that, sort of what kind of routes people get into that through. So, how much experience do people usually need? What kinds of tools? And I think saying, oh, we've got the academic folks and we've got the folks who sort of DIY their way in. And Linda's asking you a really cool question. Say, hey, when we're thinking about designing for our users, do we have to think about what kinds of devices they might be using, or what kind of operating systems or browsers they might use?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes,
no,
absolutely.
but there's so many.
So, so this again is why often the first step of being a UX designer is just getting used to data and hunting data. So, I mean, there are general reports that can tell you what proportion of as again, they will usually tell you how reliable or accurate their data is. But there's ways of finding out, like globally or maybe for a particular country, which phones, which OSs most people tend to use, and that kind of gives you a good sense of like the ecosystem, as it
Yeah.
were. Yeah, but yes, it's super important, and even if you might not be able then to design for, let's say, the top 3 or the top 4, because this all takes work. It's also good to be very clear what it is that you're optimizing for. So you can say, okay, for whatever reason, maybe maybe it's like your initial UI or whatever, you've ended up with something that really would only work perfectly, or like iOS, like an iOS 8 phone or something like that. At least say it, at least be very clear, like, do you know what? this thing is optimized for this. And that's really great then for testing. It's really great for customer service, because then at least you'll know we are likely to get complaints from people with all these different needs, because quite frankly, we might not have fully optimized for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to do just a couple more questions and set you free because I understand it's the middle of your workday. Tanya's saying, hey, A/B testing where you've got two options. It's this design or this layout or that layout. How do you like that?
I think it can be really, really good if you know exactly what it is that you will do with the answer.
Oh, okay. That sounds like there's something going on there.
Yeah. So, and I think in general, because being actually UX is, well, it's science, it's engineering, it's about data. You're using data to understand what works best. In general, that's a good route to think about anything experimental or any testing. You're almost having to think two steps ahead into the future, and not just what
Ooh.
data do I need, but also, well, what actually would I even do with this data when I get it? So yeah, A/B testing is great when you know exactly what it is that you will actually do with it. If like, so now obviously I'm talking very much from like a more of a corporate perspective. A lot of the time they get done almost out of habit, because like, oh, we just do an A/B test and then that's fine.
That's all you need to do. You
And that's
said
all you need to
A/B
do.
test out loud. It's
And
done.
yes, and it got done.
So
Yeah.
sometimes they can be sort of a box ticking exercise.
Very much so. And so therefore your role as a designer or a developer is to really say, okay, what actually is it? What impact would this make? If we find out that like 10% of people click on something if it's blue rather than it's red, okay, fine, we change it to blue, but then why? Like, what does that actually mean? What else might have changed because 10% more
Oh.
people clicked on something that was blue? So your role, so it's fantastic to do. It can, in fact, sometimes they can just be fun to just do, because then you can just see what impact a change makes. But from a research perspective, you really want to be clear with yourself, and what actually
Yeah.
happens when we have this data.
So you're telling me to do this to collect this data. Why?
Yeah.
So really encouraging folks to be lazy, to say, I'll do that. I'll do an A/B test, but only if you could tell me why I'm doing this A/B test.
Yeah, and definitely, and also to be extra interesting, ask them for the context as well, because so
Oh.
this is just being very technical and boring. Well, I think it's exciting, but like A/B tests might not work that well if you actually don't have enough people coming to the experience, and often people sometimes will cheat to get around this. Either they'll close something too early or too late. It's like really understanding what actually is it that you're trying to find, and what difference will this even make. And those two things are enough to make an A/B test worthwhile.
Nice. Hey, Florence, in sort of what they do day to day or the scope of the role, how are UI or UX focused developer, how might their roles different from sort of, we said vanilla JavaScript is plain old JavaScript, but sort of vanilla front end devs?
Interesting. So, I mean, yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. I think I can. Okay, so from my experience, what is it that I do that's different? I don't have to code. So
They can't
I
make you. I mean, they
yeah,
could make
they
you.
can't make me code. If I happen to use code to make a prototype, that's good for me. But that's not my job. My job isn't to code. My job isn't, I don't have to do unit testing. I don't have to do it. That's not what I'm being paid for. Primarily what I'm being paid for is interacting with users, doing surveys and research and interviews and all that good stuff, analyzing that data, making sense of that data, sharing that data, and using that data to actually design an experience. And that design is about maybe a bit of the information architecture, so how the different bits of content are laid out, a bit of solution architecture, if I already kind of know roughly which databases are available with what information in the company, so and all that good kind of stuff. And obviously the visual architecture, so the way something might look and how buttons work and all that kind of stuff. So that's really the big difference. Like I don't have to code, and if I don't code, I don't get into trouble. Yeah.
Ah, That sounds safe enough. We've got
Yes.
just a couple more questions and we will go ahead and escape. Tanya's asking, hey, you have any good suggestions for a portfolio for somebody who's both an engineer and a designer? And I wanted to spotlight this because we're actually just about to book not just a guest slot, but a sponsored slot. So somebody who's giving us a little bit of money to keep running these. For November, I believe it's November 11th, we're going to have somebody come in and talk really explicitly about, like, hey, let's build a portfolio site together. But do you have strong opinions?
I the thing that I like in the portfolio the most is, and sorry, I say me, I also mean other UX designers when we're hiring other UX designers. What we really like is someone can say how they have found a problem and how they solved the problem and how they know they solved the problem. Um, so that's those, so long as whatever project or whatever thing you have in your portfolio covers how you found out what the actual problem was, what you did to solve the problem, and what follow-up data, what follow-up research you did to make sure that you really had solved it. That's really the thing that counts. Um, and obviously, in terms of layout, like making sure that you're keeping to those accessibility guidelines that you would
Ooh.
hopefully be using for your actual product as well. So making sure that, as lovely as it is, you don't have too much like text and sort of images or like lots of like animations or anything, right? You're basically almost designing a website or designing a product when you're making a portfolio. So yeah, content-wise, problems you've solved and how you know you solved them. And then, in terms of layout, making sure you're keeping to good practice.
Nice and clean. Best practices, ideally. Florence, thank you so much. The I think one of our, this isn't a real challenge, but we've got folks who are continuing to ask amazing questions, and I know you've got to go ahead and get on with your day because you're in the middle of your workday. Thank you so much for joining us. And if folks wanted to non-stalkery hang out with you online, where where can they find you?
So I am on Twitter at FINOKOYE. You're more than welcome to follow me and ask questions. I tend to keep my messages open for that reason. That's often the way I answer back quickest.
Yeah.
So yes, and I'm on LinkedIn, Florence Okoye.
And for a weird tip, if you want to ask Florence a complicated question, I'd probably send her a picture of a cool pigeon as well. That's usually, yeah. Florence, thank you so much for your time. And I really do appreciate it. We had a lot of learners who were asking, what is user experience? How can I get started? What are sort of the things I should know? And you've given us this incredibly exhaustive tour of not just, oh, here's what this field is, but here's the kinds of process you would go through in a real world project. And I really appreciate that.
I'm glad to be here, and I'm really glad that it helped. So yeah.
Fab. I'll let you go. Thank you again. And for the rest of you who are part of the boot camp, I will see you either Monday or Tuesday next week. Either one, same lesson. And we're going to be starting off on accessibility. Our guest speaker next Wednesday is going to be somebody really fantastic. So they're the head of accessibility at a big fancy company. And they're going to be showing us a little bit about what the web looks like when you're using assistive technology. I'll go ahead and let all of you go, and please have the easiest possible afternoon. Bye, all, or morning, or the middle of the night. Bye.